Part of the reason our questions about the cross matter so much is that whatever we say about the cross, we're also saying about God. Most of us tend to think about God in terms of God's power. This also has been true for most of Christian theology. There's been a tendency to define God in terms of God's attributes. You probably know what I mean. We might use words like omniscient. That means God is all-knowing, or omnipotent. God is all-powerful. Or we might talk about God being all-just or all-holy. All these are ways to try and give language to something that is bigger and larger than us. And so it's understandable that we might think about God and revert almost immediately to talking about God's attributes. The challenge is that before long we've described a God that is so big, so huge, so holy, so just, that it's really hard for us to imagine this God being involved with us, this God being approachable to us, this God caring about us, this God being able to put up with us. Before long, the God of attributes can be so big that that God is terrifying, even crushing. Martin Luther, a 16th century monk and reformer of the church, had a very similar experience. He grew up in the medieval world that stressed God's attributes, that God was all just, all holy, all knowing, and it terrified him. Later in his life, Luther would look back, in fact, and say that that God, the God of attributes, not only terrified him, but drove him to hate God. Luther instead insisted on looking not at God's attributes, that is what we think about God, but instead Luther wanted us to look to what God actually did in the person of Jesus. And what Luther saw there was one who came and taught and preached and healed and forgave and was crucified. Luther was convinced finally that all of our conversations about God needed to start with the cross. You can still all talk about attributes, but you need to see those attributes, even redefine those attributes in light of what you find at that man hanging on a tree. So what does all-knowing look like when Jesus is afraid or uncertain about the future? What does all-powerful look like when you see Jesus, who we confess is God, hanging on the cross? This is what sometimes we've called Luther's theology of the cross, and this is part of what we're going to do too. We're going to be open to risking our opinions about God, to put our views of God on the table, and to ask again and again, what does that look like? What does that sound like in light of what God actually did in and through Christ's cross and resurrection? So here's our plan for getting at all of these questions. We're going to spend a fair amount of time together looking at what Christians have said across the centuries about the cross. In fact, we're going to group a lot of the best insights Christians have had into three schools of thought, or three camps, or three broad approaches to understanding God's work in the cross. These are sometimes called theories of atonement, and I just want to spend just a minute with this term, this word atonement. It's a theological word, but it's also an everyday word. It's actually a theological word that comes out of the English language, maybe one of the only ones. Most theology comes from Latin or Greek, Hebrew, German, French. But this word at its root means exactly what it says: atonement, that is, at one meant. To atone for something is to recognize that something valuable to you, something important to you, is broken. And what you want to do is somehow make up for that, repair it, make it better. Take what was broken into many pieces and make them at one again. And so each of these theories, or each of these three schools of thought about the cross, tries to understand what is going on, how God is at work to atone, to make that which was broken one once again. Before going there, though, we're first going to review the stories of the cross and resurrection in the Bible. That is, we're going to look at each of the four gospel accounts and to try to hear the distinct confession of each author about what God is up to in and through the cross of Christ. With that in mind, we'll look at these three theories of the atonement, and then we'll come back at the end and weigh these in the balance of our own experiences, our own faith, and ask together the question of how can Christ's cross and resurrection not only be important in general, but also important to us? How can what God did so long ago in and through Christ's cross and resurrection shape our lives today?